Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that won't settle for bad public transit. I am Jason from Not Just Bikes, and I'm joined today once again by Reese from RM Transit. Welcome back.
It's great to be here.
Yes, it's always good to see you. We very often, we can talk very long time about lots of different subjects.
Yes.
But this particular podcast came about because while I was in Toronto this summer, you and I went out for dinner, of course, and then afterwards, we started talking about streetcars and trams and sat down in a park and talked about streetcars and trams for a very long time. And
Quite a while.
We should really be talking about this on a podcast because it was quite entertaining. Just to bring everybody up to speed here, I'm a really big fan of trams. I like them quite a lot. I used to live in Toronto for several years. I've taken the streetcar, as they call it there, to work many times. I live in Amsterdam now. I take the tram not too often because cycling is quite common here. Most things are very close by for me, but I take the tram whenever I can because genuinely I like trams. I think for various reasons, they are one of the best forms of public transit within a city. And maybe we'll get to that. I don't know. But one of the things that has really surprised me is that there are some cities that do trams so well. And I think Amsterdam is one of them that does it pretty well. You know, maybe not perfect, but they do it very, very well. And there are some cities that do them not so well. And in North America, the word streetcar kind of has a bad name. A lot of people think of streetcars as these slow things that are always stuck in traffic, and they're absolutely awful. And North American cities are building new lines, which they don't call streetcars, they call them LRTs. And we can get into that too. But what I have noticed is, especially when I go back to Toronto after living in Amsterdam, just how bad the streetcars are. It's just absolutely shocking how bad they are. And I think, here it is, my literal favorite way of getting around the city for various reasons that we could get into or not, or I'll make a video about it, or we'll see. But here it is, my favorite form of transportation around the city, and it's so painful. It's hard to be a fan of trams when you live in Toronto. So let's get started. Why is that?
Well, I think that Toronto is a good case study in what I would say is my issue with trams. And I actually do really like trams as well.
You've seen good trams, right? You've been to Paris. Yeah. You've been on great trams.
Yeah.
You know your trams.
Definitely. I remember when I was a kid taking a trip to Amsterdam and seeing what are modern trams, like the low floor trams, and thinking, hey, Toronto doesn't have those at the time. And what was kind of cool is when I moved to Toronto for university, they had started to finally get the low floor trams in Toronto. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So they're kind of going to be just like in Amsterdam soon, right?
I had exactly the same feeling. I was living in Toronto too when the rollout of those Bombardier Flexities, I think they're called.
Yeah, and it was dramatic because It's funny now, they don't feel big. But back when I first saw one of them, they looked enormous compared to the old trams Toronto had, which were kind of high floor, only a bit bigger than a bus.
Yeah, well, those CRV ones, not the LCRV or whatever, the long ones, but the CRV ones, they were, just barely longer than a bus, right?
Yeah, essentially only a little longer. And because they were high floor, the entire space was passenger space. There wasn't a weird bump at the back or whatever. Yeah. And so they were really big. They actually were quite fast because they could kind of accelerate and brake like a bus. They would, trip you up if you weren't holding on because they could go quite quickly. Yeah. They also had opening windows, which you could kind of hang your arm out like you're going along the beach and you kind of have your arm out the convertible window, just, casually cruising on the streetcar.
I must say, I do miss those, not from the actual transportation of them, but I do miss them for that experience of them. They really were cool vehicles.
Yeah, they were lovely. And Toronto kept them way too long. I think that a big problem for Toronto was instead of slowly rolling in new models, like some other cities like Melbourne and Amsterdam did, where they kind of bought 30 or 40 new trams a year, and then you got this progressive rollout, they decided to wait until the last minute. I think it was basically because they didn't have funding to do it.
Well, it's politics, really.
Yeah, and then roll them all over at once. And the issue with doing that is that then they had issues with some of the welding in them and stuff, and they weren't getting delivered on time. It seems like the Toronto streetcar network is a perpetual crisis, and that's a big problem for any transit system, right? If you look at a lot of transit systems in the United States, I would actually say it's quite similar to the Toronto streetcar network in that they never seem to be running properly. There's always something shut down. There's always some slow zone, and the Toronto streetcar network basically functions like that. In Canada, the rail systems typically work pretty well. And so it definitely highlights all up and down, besides the vehicles now, but even parts of the vehicles, it's just suboptimal. And when you look at cities in Europe, like Amsterdam is a good example, they've just done a lot of things right that Toronto hasn't. Toronto's got the new vehicles, but there are so many elements to a good tram system, and we've just scratched the surface. And I think a big problem, and part of the reason Toronto's have so many problems, is that there's no good tram system in North America really today.
Yeah.
You can't go over, take a high-speed train 2 hours and see a good tram system, right? Like in terms of legacy tram systems in North America, it's Boston, San Fran, Philly, Toronto.
And New Orleans.
Yeah, New Orleans. But I mean, New Orleans and then some of the other systems that do exist are basically tourist systems.
Yeah, right.
Like they're not even.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are the Obama era streetcars, which are also terrible. And so it's just like, it's really hard for people to envision what good even looks like. And so I think that's a big barrier. It's not like, oh, wow, look at Paris. We got to get our act together up here in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Well, I think that is part of it. I know that when I talk to Torontonians or Philadelphians or San Franciscans about streetcars, about trams, they're like, oh, God, yeah, those things. I mean, they're just so slow. They're just so, whatever. And I think you're absolutely right that there really just aren't a lot of people in North America that know how good trams could be. And so they don't even know what to ask for.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to kind of dissect a few things here because I used to take the streetcar to work fairly often in various places that I lived when I did work in downtown Toronto and near, streetcars. Those few times where I wasn't working at some suburban office park somewhere, which was horrid. But I remember in particular, like I used to live in Riverdale near the streetcar in Broadview, and I used to work down on John Street, just west of downtown. So I was looking at this. I think it's about 5.5 kilometers on the streetcar. And I was looking at this online before our podcast here. And Google says that it'll take 35 minutes. Now, it never took 35 minutes. It was always slower than that. But let's pretend that it takes 35 minutes. I started looking at a few different routes that were around the same length here in Amsterdam. And, no matter which route I tried or which combination, I could never get a route about the same length to be more than half the time of 35 minutes, like literally twice as fast for the same distance. Yeah. And that's just shocking to me, but that really does track my experience. Like I take the trams here fairly regularly. I mean, at least a couple of times a month at the very minimum, usually more than that. And they're just quick. And then when I go to Toronto on holiday, like I did this summer, they're really freaking slow. So I kind of want to break down what some of these reasons are for the slowness. I don't know where you want to start. If you've got an idea, I've got a few things in mind.
I think one way we could approach it is we could just imagine, what does the journey look like? And then think about each way along the journey, where is it slowing down in Toronto?
Right.
So I think the first place you start is that in Toronto, well, you have to tell me because, while I have spent some time on the trams in Amsterdam. Both times I've been in Amsterdam for about a week each time, I was on Overtoom, which has a tram line on it, like near the Vondelpark.
Yeah.
The sense I get, I'm sure there are maybe some mixed traffic tram lines, or there are parts, I know for sure.
Yeah.
But
there are.
A sense I get is that there is not the predominance of you have to walk into the street to get on the tram. To be clear, that does exist in a lot of cities. In Europe, for example, but it's typically in kind of suburban locations or in lower density areas where that's just how the trams were when they were like horse cars, and they've been slowly evolved over time. But in Toronto, often on quite busy streets where there's fast-moving traffic, you have to walk into the street. Now, to be fair, the cars sometimes drive by, and it can be a bit sketchy. Generally, it's not as bad as I think people imagine it would be, but it's not great.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, so that is a funny one. That's a great place to start. So to anybody that hasn't taken a streetcar, any Europeans listening who hasn't taken a streetcar in Toronto, the streetcar runs in the middle of the road and it just stops in the middle of the road and you just have to walk out into the middle of the road to get to it. Now, the old streetcars, the ones that we were just talking romantically about, used to have this funny little sign. I loved it. This little stop sign that would pop out at the back of it to show drivers that there was literally a stop sign there and they had to stop. For the most part, when a streetcar has its doors open, people in Toronto stop. That is a thing that most drivers do. I think there are some people that drive by. It used to be worse in the past. I think they started finding people for it. But anyway, With the new ones, there's no stop. There are red lights that flash and the doors open, and generally then the traffic stops. But I think this is one of the first kind of ridiculous things is that when a streetcar is boarding, everything's stopped. Like the whole road is stopped. Nobody's getting around because this is usually on a 4-lane street. So there'll be streetcar tracks in the middle. Streetcars are almost always in mixed traffic in Toronto. There is an exception. We'll talk about that, a couple exceptions. But for the most part, it's in the middle of the street. So the streetcar's blocking one lane. The people boarding are blocking the other lane, and everything's blocked. And I think when it comes from the Rob Ford side of the Rob Ford loving drivers, that's the thing they hate the most is that it's there, this big thing in the middle of the road, and they can't move.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, I think that there is in that lockdown somewhere, there's a point to be made, which is that in other cities, and even in Toronto, in some locations, not on routes that have dedicated lanes, there are places where there will be these islands for passengers to board. And that's quite common in European cities. And what that basically does, and to be fair, this isn't only an issue for drivers in places where bike lanes exist, which is increasing on some streetcar routes, for example.
Yeah.
The bike traffic has to stop as well a lot of the time.
Yes.
So the reason to have an island for pedestrians to kind of like a platform essentially for them to stand on and board from is that way people can keep going around on the outside of the island. And in that way, it's kind of like a multi-stage pedestrian crossing that, obviously, again, common in Europe, basically not existent in North America.
Yeah, I have never seen a boarding of a tram in Amsterdam that wasn't some sort of platform. I don't think they exist. Maybe they do. I don't think so, though. I really don't think so.
Which is an accessibility nightmare in Toronto as well.
Yeah, and it is. And I remember that, actually, speaking of accessibility, well, okay, first of all, accessibility is ridiculous with these streetcars because they're low-floor streetcars, but because you just board them from the street, there's a gap, which any other city would have, like, as we said, a little platform that you'd go up, and then it's a level boarding, right? Or, there's various other ways to deal with it. But in Toronto, there's almost always a gap. And so if you are in a wheelchair, then everything stops even longer and the driver gets out and gets this little ramp out and attaches the ramp and it takes forever. It's such a pain in the ass.
Yeah, the accessibility function of these new streetcars is really poorly implemented. And because you can only use one door, the driver has to get out. The ramp is sketchy because it's extremely steep. The whole process is just not very well thought out. And it's one of those cases where, if you were someone in a wheelchair, you'd actually probably feel a bit self-conscious because you're stopping everything for
a long time, too.
Yeah. For 3-4 minutes while they do this whole process.
And that's what just blows me away. I remember the first time I went to Switzerland and there were proper trams where...
Probably with level boarding.
It didn't even feel like a platform. It was just that cars couldn't go by in that area and the sidewalk kind of went up and then it just all worked. And I watched these people with wheelchairs just wheel on, wheel off, any door they want, no problem. And I was like, holy crap.
It's shocking that there seems to be no interest in learning about how other places do things in Toronto. And so the boarding is a huge thing. And I would say that boarding alone definitely slows things down. Because if you think about it, people can't just board immediately. A lot of people will still be standing on the sidewalk reasonably, waiting until the streetcar stops. You hold your hand
out until they stop. Then you have to make sure traffic stops.
To make sure that no one is going to, drive through. And so that alone, just getting on the streetcar, plus the fact that you have to step up, that actually does add time as well, especially when, it's old people or people with little carts or bikes getting on.
Yeah.
So even just getting from the sidewalk onto the streetcar, you're already losing time versus every other system in the world.
I remember there are a couple, like you said, of those platforms. The one that pops to mind is College Street at Spadina, where they have a little platform where you can get on the streetcar, but they can be quite narrow at times. I remember that Toronto actually several years ago removed some of those because they weren't wide enough for wheelchairs. So it was they weren't wide enough for wheelchairs, so they removed the platform.
Instead of just widening the platform.
Widening it, yeah. But they said, well, there's not enough room because the cars have to go around. But of course, that's the thing in Toronto. The cars always have to be there. I feel I know that in Amsterdam, if there isn't enough room to put a platform, then the cars don't go around. That's it. There is no way for the cars to go around. Either that part of the street is just a modal filter and cars aren't allowed to drive through there at all, or they have to wait for the tram to go and then drive behind the tram. And that's just it. But Toronto would never, ever, ever do that. There's no way in hell. Which is
totally in a location like College Street at Spadina, which, to be fair, I think still has its platform. You could totally do that. College Street it's a street that does not need to have 4 lanes. It doesn't in a lot of places. It has parking in one of those lanes.
Yeah, and they have some nicer bike lanes now west of Spadina, I saw.
Yeah.
But this is the thing with a lot of North American cities, and Toronto definitely follows this. the cars have to go on every street all the time. Like, there's no such idea as like the cars go on this street and the transit goes on that street. Like, it's very, very, very common in Europe, and certainly in Amsterdam. There's lots and lots of places where like this is the street that is for cyclists and public transit, and cars don't go here unless they're emergency vehicles or something. But that's just not a concept in Toronto. Cars go on every street
not really,
all the time.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, so it's slower to get on in the first place because you got to walk into the street and wait for the traffic to stop. Maybe wait for them to put the silly little ramp out because they haven't built a proper platform. So what's next? Because I think the next thing we can maybe talk about is the next stop and how close it is.
Yeah, so the next stop is going to be, so this is my personal bugbear. And the reason I say that is because it seems like the thing that could be fixed the most quickly of all of our problems is just that in Toronto, there is a dearth of stops. And that is a problem that the data kind of bears out. If you look at the average stop spacings in a bunch of cities, from Paris, Amsterdam, Toronto's streetcar stop spacings are often around 200 meters apart, which means that you only have a few streetcar lengths before you get to another stop. And this has become a much bigger problem because the new streetcars, which are really nice, are also really heavy, and which means that they cannot speed up and slow down quite as fast as the more nimble old CLRV streetcars. And so that means that there is a lot of time spent speeding up, slowing down, and stopping. And, people say, oh, if I didn't have a stop within 200 meters of me, I might have to walk 400 meters in this, completely ignoring the fact that yes, you might have to walk slightly longer, but that would mean your streetcar journey could be much faster because people would be consolidated at the stops.
Yeah, and I know it's always difficult to get rid of somebody's stop. I mean, I'd be pretty pissed if they got rid of the stop near our house, of course. But yeah, you're right. It is crazy when I'm on the streetcar in Toronto. It feels like it never, ever gets up to speed. Like you're on this modern-looking streetcar. The Bombardier Flexities are as modern-looking as trams anywhere. But they just never seem to get to speed. They slowly take off and then they slow down again for the next stop, which is, again, only a few hundred meters away. And some of them are crazy close, like literally 100 meters away, 120 meters away.
What's crazy about it is I remember being in Berlin this last October and riding one of the trams from the Hauptbahnhof towards Alexanderplatz. And the tram leaves the stop. And we're just moving. And then we're just going fast.
I just did that trip in October when I went with my son to see the dinosaurs in the Natural History Museum.
Yeah, and it lasts like you're moving at speed for like 2 minutes before you get off.
Yeah, and you're motoring. Like you're like, whoa, we are moving here, Like you're passing cars, you're passing everybody.
Yeah, because the stops are not jammed in together. And so this is then a personal bugbear for me. And I think what makes it doubly bad is that, as we mentioned, Toronto has these really kind of crappy stops. What makes them crappier is that they don't have like real canopies at a lot of them. If you look at European tram stops, I mean, it's kind of pretty standard to have a really large canopy. It's not a bus shelter. Like it can fit 20 people standing under it if it's raining.
Right.
In Toronto, it's very rare to not just have a bus shelter at a streetcar stop.
Or even just a stick. Like a lot of them are just a sign on a stick and that's it.
And it doesn't even get its own pole. It's just attached to some other pole.
Right. Yes. And sometimes, like, I saw that when I was in Toronto this last time. I was in an area that I hadn't been to in a long time. And I was walking along looking, where is the stop here? Like, I'm kind of looking, like, trying to figure out where the streetcar stop is. And eventually it was just that. It was this tiny little red and white sign just stuck to the side of a pole that was used for something else.
Yeah. And so if you have stops like that, if you got rid of some of them, could you not, use the funds that you would use to maintain that stop to make the other stops nicer and to maybe install some accessibility features and stuff? And so I think that the having too many stops thing is like a 1-2 punch. It makes the tram slower, but it also means that each stop doesn't get the same treatment. I mean, you don't really have ticket machines at most stops, and the ones that do have ticket machines, I don't think they work. You don't have those large, comfortable canopies, which is a big thing. Like, I think people underrate how nice having shelter is. When you're on a transit trip and you have to stand in the rain or something.
If it's raining or it's snowy or windy, that canopy is a godsend.
Yeah, and it's just like you feel kind of undignified to be standing out in the rain, watching people go by you and they're dry. And so having a canopy kind of makes the tram experience, I think that's kind of one of the parts of it, is that it's almost like a train station. You're properly protected from the weather, until the vehicle pulls up. It's a kind of elevated experience.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll get to this when we talk about LRTs, but sometimes Toronto goes the other way and goes like way past what it needs to be and becomes this massive station, but we'll get to that, I think. But in Amsterdam, it's very, very normal for a tram stop to have a couple of canopies, enough, as you said, to maybe hold, 20 people or something like that from the rain. There'll be a digital sign that tells you when the next tram is coming, which again is something extraordinarily rare for streetcars in Toronto. And this is one of the real memories I have of riding the streetcar in Toronto, is standing out. It's cold or it's dark or it's miserable or whatever. And everybody's just kind of stepping a little bit into the road to look down the road to see if they can see that light of the streetcar, right? Because nobody knows when the damn thing's coming.
Yeah, and I think something that Toronto doesn't do very much, but which is great in Amsterdam, and I can remember experiencing this on Overtoom, was that the streetcar network, and this is true in a lot of European cities, it's quite interlined. So there's a lot of different branches and stuff.
Yeah.
And what that means is those screens, they don't even just tell you when the streetcars are coming, but they're going to tell you what routes are coming. Right. And so you can see in advance, so you can step forward or step back. Hey, this is mine. I remember getting on streetcars in Toronto in the past, and they have a screen, but it's not a very good screen. And literally just having to guess if I am on the right route, because the only difference sometimes is an A or B at the end of the route name.
Right.
And you don't know if they're going to end up in the totally wrong location. Whereas in Amsterdam, the nice screen, it tells you when it's coming and it's telling you it's the tram you need or a different tram going somewhere else.
Right. It has the final destination and everything else, which, I don't want to rant about it too much, but short turns, man. That was the other thing I remember about streetcars in Toronto, the short turn. It would say short turn on it, and all you knew is that it wasn't going to get to the final destination. And sometimes it wasn't entirely clear where it was going to stop and turn around, because they would have gaps in service and problems because they're stuck in traffic and all the other things we're going to talk about. That your streetcar just stops and say, okay, everybody off now. I'm now going to turn and become a 506 or something. And you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go stand out in the cold again and hope that the next one coming by isn't a short turn.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think that the naming convention, and that highlights another thing. Toronto kind of makes it needlessly complicated, and it's kind of almost like a bit of an in thing. Like, to use the streetcars in Toronto often requires a bit of thinking that you don't require in other cities, because the routes have kind of weird names. They're not always entirely intuitive, what it means, especially because some routes, they go on multiple streets, like 504 King. You might wonder, what does 504 mean? Is there a 503 King? The thing stepping into the street. So many people who I know who visit me in Toronto are like, how the hell do we get on this thing? Where's the stop? I don't see it. Whereas in Amsterdam and other cities, Paris is one that I think people should check out for its trams. It's just much more intuitive. And so I think that's a big part of the experience as well.
Well, actually, and before we move on to the next thing slowing us down, one of the things that does drive me nuts in Toronto is this idea that the streetcars just go straight along one street on the grid, and the next one goes along a few streets up, and it's this grid pattern. And the idea is that if you ever want to go diagonally, you're going to be guaranteed to have to take two streetcars at the very least, because it's meant to go east-west and it's meant to go north-south and nothing else. And there aren't a lot of north-souths for what it's worth. There should be more. But when I look at other cities, now I know that Amsterdam's not a grid, but when I look at other cities, they don't kind of follow these straight lines. They'll do these intelligent routes that might be somebody here might want to go this way through the city and another person might want to go that way. And they're kind of more diagonal at times. And there are some that they'll merge for a while. They'll continue on the same track for a while. So it's really easy to jump off one and jump onto the other. And in Toronto, this is the same with the suburban buses, which are good by North American standards, actually. But one of the things that annoyed me taking suburban buses as well is you get dropped off on one side of the intersection, then you have to wait until you can cross the intersection to the other side to go the other direction. Whereas with these trams in Europe, they're more often set up such that there'll be some, not zigzaggy, but more, diagonal, more direct route in some ways from important place to important place. Then they'll double up in the middle and you can just kind of hop off and hop on to the next one if you're not going the exact same route.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, we keep using Amsterdam, but I just think Amsterdam is a good example of this. The routes are more kind of destination oriented than corridor oriented.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's less about, in Toronto, every route is really oriented around a main corridor that it just follows for almost the entire route.
Yeah, it's this is the street. This is St. Clair. This is Spadina. This is King.
Exactly. In Amsterdam, it's more again, I think of Overtoom, there's a tram that goes from there to Central Station. There's a tram that goes from there that kind of goes to Zoud, to the south of the city. And so you're if I need to go to the south, I can take this tram. If I need to go to the north, I can take this tram. You have options at a single stop. And as you mentioned, I think this is totally underrated. by having multiple routes go through the same sections of track in various places, and that's a nice thing about trams, is when you see the tracks, you know the tram is going to come to this spot, unlike buses.
Yes.
But what that means is you kind of get almost like a cross-platform transfer. You get off the tram, another tram shows up 2 minutes later, and it's going in a different direction. You get on that one, and it takes you off where you need to go.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. When I take trams in Amsterdam, if I'm going a longer distance, I often take them. Well, you know what? Honestly, I take trams just because I prefer them. So unless they're way slower, I will take them. But I'm often taking them because it's a distance that I don't feel like cycling for whatever reason. I could, but I just don't want to. And so it may require taking more than one tram, but it's easy because, first of all, they come very, very frequently. So I'm not going to have to wait that long. So that's nice, because that's another important part, is that the frequency is often enough that transferring is not a big deal, because I know I'm not going to be waiting like 15 minutes or 20 minutes for a tram to come by. It'll be like 3 to 6 minutes or something, right? But there'll be these certain stations that I've gotten to know very well because they are the transfer stations. So I'll come up to whatever, Museumplein or something like that, and there's like 3-4 tram lines that go through there, and I'll know I hop off there and hop on to the next one. And it's very, very, very easy.
Yeah, and I think they're kind of visually attractive too, in a way that bus hubs just aren't. You know, like they're kind of messy diesel fumes going all over the place. Yes, we can have some electric buses and stuff, but I think that is kind of the elegance of trams, is that you can have like a bunch of loops and the trams can all come together very easily. And I mean, as a cyclist, I think they're very good, or as a pedestrian, because unlike buses, they don't kind of buff it back and forth. So you can be comfortably walking very close to a tram or cycling right next to it, and you know it's not going to slide over and hit you. And so I think that they really integrate nicely in urban spaces. And I think a great example of this, you actually would know the specific spot. I don't know what the name of it is, but there is a spot in Amsterdam where the trams are going over like several bridges in a row, and they go from single track to double track a bunch of times. And that kind of thing is really cool. And it's super space efficient. And it's something you wouldn't really see with buses, because the bus driver can't be expected to move quickly and accurately go through these crowds of people along these bridges. But a tram can do it very easily.
Actually, the most amazing thing to watch if you're in Amsterdam is to go down to Leidseplein, which is a pedestrianized street. Actually, it's great history. I should make a video about it someday. But if you go down to Leidseplein and you're walking along there, it's a very narrow street, lots of tourists, and in the evening, lots of drunken tourists. And it has that gauntlet track where the tracks come together and they, in both directions end up going the same way. One will wait for the other. And yet there are tons of people around and drunken tourists and everything. And these trams just like go through it, no problem, nice and easily. People just kind of step to the side and that's it.
This makes me very angry because right now TIFF is going on in Toronto.
Oh, don't get me started.
Yeah, you'll know what I'm going for.
I know exactly what you're going to talk about. Okay, tell people.
Yeah, so every year in Toronto, we have a film festival. It's a great festival. No one doesn't like film. Like, come on, we're YouTubers. Like, this kind of our thing. But every year, they shut down like the most important streetcar route for the film festival. Instead of just doing that, instead of just having a special setup where trams can just operate down the middle, it works, again, around drunken people. It can't work around film festival goers.
It drives me crazy. This is a street that is King Street, like 4 lanes wide. It's massive. There's plenty of room. They've got the streetcar tracks going down the middle of it. And yeah, every single time there's a film festival, they block off the trams. And it's dumb for so many reasons. Like there are places like in Rotterdam, in Amsterdam, all over Europe, in many different places, trams go through pedestrian areas. And they do it beautifully. They integrate so well. Because again, like you said, you see the tracks. You know where it's going to come. It's not a surprise to anybody, right? And yet at TIFF, they block off the streetcars because this Toronto mentality that it's too dangerous to have these trains running down the street. But not only that, like TIFF is a major destination and they've just shut off a huge part of the public transportation.
Yeah. I think that it kind of highlights a lot of the kind of brainworms, right? Ignoring a major form of transportation, assuming that it's dangerous to have streetcars near humans, but there is no problem having huge amounts of road traffic near people all the time.
Right.
That's totally okay. And yeah, just the way that people are actually integrated into events like that. But maybe we should get to the next source of slowness, which I would say is probably traffic.
Yeah, let's get to traffic. I mean, the streetcars run in mixed traffic basically all the time.
Yeah.
There's a couple exceptions. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, if you're riding on a streetcar in Toronto, you're going to be stuck behind cars. And one of the things that always used to bug the hell out of me, and when I was in Toronto, there's so many drivers that are like, oh, I hate driving in Toronto. I get stuck behind a streetcar. And I'm like, dude, there's like 100 people on that streetcar. You are not stuck behind a streetcar. They are stuck behind you. And it is so infuriating when you are in Toronto on a streetcar that's packed with literally 100 people. I think the Flexities can carry up to 160 crush capacity.
More than that,
140?
like 200.
Oh my God. Really? Jesus.
Yeah, a huge number.
So like you're on the streetcar, it's crowded. There's over 100 people on it. And you look out the front window and everybody's stopped because there's one car turning left. And you're like, why the hell does this exist? There is literally one person making a left turn and it blocks hundreds of us on a street.
And it's definitely, it could be quite a radicalizing thing because I think that like, no matter what politician is in political office in Toronto, what prime minister we have, what premier of Ontario we have, no one seems to just go, this is insane.
It is literally insane.
There are like 8 streets in Toronto with streetcars.
Yeah.
The cars need to get total priority on, like, how many streets? There's going to be thousands of streets in Toronto, and the 8 that have streetcars, we cannot be serious about giving them aggressive priority over private vehicles.
This is the thing, like in Amsterdam, it is so normal for a stretch of street to have a few blocks that cars can't go through. It's just, that's a thing. You just can't go through here for whatever reason. It's too narrow, or it's just we get too much traffic here, or whatever. They'll just say cars can't go for these few blocks. Period. That's it. You go on a different street, right, that doesn't have a streetcar on it. That is so incredibly normal. And so even when you see, like I get this all the time where, some naysayer who doesn't understand this stuff at all will look at one of my videos and say, oh yeah, well, look at this street view clip of this street in Amsterdam. It looks just like, Queen Street in Toronto. What are you complaining about? And I'm like, you don't understand that that's a local traffic only. There's no through traffic in there at all. The number of cars that are going to be there on that, what looks like a typical mixed traffic street, is minuscule, like a tiny, tiny number. Nobody's going to be getting in the way of the trams. Whereas that same street design in Toronto will just be like, yeah, cars everywhere, parking on the sides, cars all over the place. Like, this is the other thing. There'll be like parallel parking on, say, Queen Street or something like that. I was on Queen West and I just watched like a streetcar again full of people waiting for one guy to figure out his parallel parking. We're like, this is great.
Which is a big reason there just shouldn't be parking on any street that has a streetcar. It has a streetcar. Why the hell do you need to park on it? There is parking for public transit users at various subway stations in the suburbs. If people have a car and they need to get to Queen Street West, they can park at the subway and take the subway to a streetcar route and take the streetcar. Like, it is beyond comprehension. And I think that this is a place that in some ways, Toronto is actually worse than some other cities. So
yeah.
I grew up in Vancouver, which does not have trams. But like many cities, it did have trams at one point. But where I spent a lot of time growing up was Portland in Oregon. And Portland has arguably the best modern streetcar system in America. And it has a big LRT system. And there are problems with it for sure. But I think it is the closest thing to a European tram system in North America. It's actually very well designed. There are streets that are dedicated to public transit through the downtown in both north, south, and east-west directions. So you have buses and streetcars doing this dance where they're basically interleaving, and one block is for the streetcars, one block is for the buses type of thing.
Which is utterly normal outside of North America for what it's worth.
Yeah, but what's amazing to me is that Toronto, and I think that this is kind of the fundamental problem, in keeping the streetcars, Toronto kind of decided that the streetcar, we were going to keep it and we were never going to change it because it is perfect the way it is. In Europe, a lot of places ripped out their streetcars and rebuilt them completely in a kind of modern way. That's what Paris did. And then cities like Amsterdam that didn't rip them out, modernized them and completely kind of redesigned how they work. But in Toronto, I think that's the original sin basically, is that nothing has changed fundamentally from how streetcars worked when there weren't even regular cars around and when the vehicles were tiny and there isn't any intelligent design. Even if you go to some of these LRT systems in America, you'll see like little glimmers of, oh, this is actually thoughtful. They thought about this intersection or this section going through the city center. It's probably not very frequent. It's probably not very fast, but you can see through. You're like, oh, if we did this in more places, this could come together and make something good.
Absolutely. But again, Toronto just cannot get past this idea that cars need to go down every street all the time, everywhere, no restrictions whatsoever, period. Like the best they'll do is no left turns or no right turns, but that most of the time is for car traffic.
And it isn't followed. Like, I mean, people make left turns anyways. There's no like camera enforcement or whatever. I think they're talking about that, but I mean, they could have done it 20 years ago.
Of course they could have. But, we've talked about this on this podcast before, that car drivers are untouchable in Toronto politics. But I want to talk about, so there are actually a few places where streetcars in Toronto don't run in mixed traffic, and yet they are still painfully slow. First, I want to talk about the little step up, King Street. So a few years ago, around the time I was leaving, actually, in 2018, Toronto decided that they would do the intelligent thing and make one streetcar street do a trial, which did kind of become semi-permanent, that a street, King Street, would not be a through street to cars. Cars could drive on other streets, Richmond and Adelaide that run parallel to it.
Which are basically like a highway.
Yeah, literally freaking highways. It's ludicrous that this was ever a thing. I mean, cars should be basically banned on Queen Street and King Street, but that's a whole other issue. But King Street said, okay, so we're going to make it so that this is no longer a through street. So there are certain intersections where cars are not allowed to drive through. Now, this was extraordinarily poorly implemented. It made me so angry because I went to a lot of the community meetings about this project. I was very deeply involved in it because this was incredibly important to me. And they had these plans originally that like every so often one block would just be like they do in here in Amsterdam. It would be like a park, streetcars only. You couldn't get through any other way, grass on the ground, the grassy tram tracks that the streetcars would go across. There'd be all these planters and stuff. So it would basically be like every 3 or 4 blocks, there'd be effectively a park, right? That was fully pedestrianized and nobody could drive through it. You wouldn't be able to drive through it because it's literally you'd be driving through a park. So nobody would ever drive through it. It would work very well. That isn't what happened because of concessions that happened and actually just full-on sabotaging by suburban councillors. They argued that taxis should still be able to use the streetcar tracks in the evening. They should be able to go through in the evening. So there was an exception.
Because it would be a disaster if they had to go on a street that was 10 meters in one direction or the other direction instead of driving down King Street. No taxi passenger could have gone to Queen or Richmond or Adelaide or any other street.
It's ludicrous. The whole thing was ludicrous. I watched live the city council meetings and I was just screaming at the screen. It was so, I don't even want to get into how angry I was at this thing, but it was full on sabotage. It was done by the same typical suburban assholes that sabotage all of these projects in Toronto, Stephen Holiday and Mamalidi and Ford and all these other people. You know them. So this was done to sabotage the project, and it did because now it looks like a giant, huge, wide open street. It's still a 4-lane street. Nothing else has been changed. They do have these concrete barriers that come in for boarding so that at least cars can't drive around the streetcars. Yeah. They can't go around the open doors. So they did do that. But otherwise, you have to be paying attention to notice the sign that says you can't go through. And then, of course, it has times on it, right? So it says no straight through, and you're driving, and you're like, well, wait, what is this? 2300?
And there's 5 lights.
Yeah, 11 p.m. to this, and I'm just like, what is this? Can I go through here now or not? It's nonsense. So it just looks like a street. And for a while, they started ticketing drivers, but literally everybody would cry, I didn't see the sign. And then they'd be let off with a warning. And
it's just anything where you have to rely on police in a city that we literally did. I think our first episode was on Toronto police being useless, right? Yeah. The issue is that, okay, they're out now. What happens in a week when they're not out? Then you just go back to the status quo of drivers not doing anything to, follow the rules. The issue, I think you would probably point out, is just that it's not designed in such a way that it makes it's not even just obvious to a driver that you can't go a certain way. They haven't changed the paving or anything.
Yeah.
I think they were supposed to, but it's been delayed. And the existing stuff is deteriorating. There was these tactile, the things you have at the edge of a train platform, they put those down and they just came loose because they're just glued to the pavement. And now they're just floating around King Street. So King Street actually looks worse than it looked before because now it has these yellow barriers on it and the yellow panels floating around everywhere.
Yeah, that was intentional sabotage by suburban councillors, though. I watched it happen. I know it happened. And those same assholes sabotage everything, and I hate them. But King Street is definitely better. It has way less traffic because people's GPS programs will never send them down there, right? So if you do need to drive through, your GPS will tell you the intelligent thing to go to whatever, Wellington or Adelaide or Richmond, and you will drive along those instead. And so it does have way less traffic, and the streetcars do run better. But, we'll get to that in a second. Traffic lights. But I want to talk about the two that absolutely have their own right-of-way, St. Clair and Spadina.
And Harbourfront.
And Harbourfront. Yes, Harbourfront. Almost forgot about Harbourfront. Yes. But they're still painfully slow. And why are they slow? So the first one is traffic lights. This is the thing that, beyond waiting behind a driver turning left or something, this is the thing that drives me the most crazy coming from Amsterdam trams. When you're on a tram in Amsterdam, you do not wait for a red light. It is extraordinarily rare to be on a tram in Amsterdam and get stopped at a red light. This happens almost never. And in fact, when it does happen, it's usually because there's a
tram in the other
vehicle,
direction or something,
a bus or a tram in the other direction that got there first. So when you're on a tram in Amsterdam and it takes off from the stop, you just go. You just motor it. Like the traffic lights turn green for you, one after another in lockstep. Then when you pull up to the stop, it'll go red. People can do their thing. But when that driver's ready to go, when that tram driver's ready to go, the light turns green and you go. That does not happen in Toronto because there is no transit signal priority.
No, I mean, so the thing that's funny is that they'll say on paper there's a form of transit signal priority. And this is the issue I have in general with trams, is that so much of it comes down to the quality of your design and your implementation, right? Yes. Like in Toronto, you on paper have a lot of the things you need, but they don't function in the way that you need them to for anything to work properly. So you don't have the signal priority. And in fact, the signals are generally designed in such a way that makes streetcar service slower. So on Spadina, as we mentioned on a lot of the east-west streetcar routes, left turns are banned at the major intersections.
Yep.
On Spadina, they're often given a dedicated signal phase. And so what that means is that you could be sitting on a streetcar and you have to wait while someone makes a left turn. It could be one car that makes a left turn in front of you.
It can be no cars that make a left turn. On some of the lights, it just goes to the advanced green for cars. Even though there's no car there, you just sit there. Everybody.
And I mean, that's just North American traffic signals being stupid. In Europe in general, the systems are just much more sophisticated. In North America, the only sophisticated traffic signaling systems appear to be the ones designed for cars. Yeah. There's some guy who makes videos about highways, and they have this insane, I forget what it's called in the US, they have this insane type of pedestrian crossing that stops single lanes of traffic as a person walks across the street.
Oh my good God.
And this kind of technology, right? It's if it was implemented for public transit where it was a complete priority and it was doing all this, it could be amazing. But of course, it's only implemented to minimize the amount that a human being would stop a car, which is brutal.
So yes, going down Spadina, you'll routinely stop at red lights all the time. The streetcar will be stopped at the stop before the street light. The street light will be green. And then everybody gets on. And then the streetcar is ready to go and the light turns red. And you're like, oh my good God. Then you sit there and the other direction goes. And then, like on Spadina, there'll be an advanced green for cars going in your direction. And they get to go first. That's one of those things that blows my mind on Spadina. Even if you are going to have the dedicated left turn, the advanced green for car drivers, just put the light green for the streetcar first. Let them get through and then do the advanced green for cars, right? But no, the cars go first all the time. Cars go first.
And this is the thing that's funny is that it's not even universally the case. I feel like in Vancouver, for example, where I grew up, because, I grew up in a suburban area, and it was kind of accepted that, hey, if you go downtown, it's going to be the Wild West for you in a car. The transit gets the priority in downtown. In Toronto, the deprioritization of transit is a citywide phenomenon, even in the city center, where the vast majority of people are getting around on foot, on bikes, or on transit. It is still dominated by drivers, even on streets where it's King Street or something, where it's 10-1 people outside of cars versus people in cars. For the longest time, people in cars were given priority. And it's illogical, but it's a big reason that the streetcar system doesn't work, is that it requires buy-in from the transportation department. And when people want to sabotage it, it's sabotageable. It can be sabotaged.
Very easily sabotageable. And that King Streetcar, I remember reading,
it worked really well.
Before the change, moved 80,000 people per day, which is just a crazy number of people.
Which is a very respectable number. For trams, it's a huge number of people internationally even. It's not as high as the highest routes in Paris, but it would be considered really good.
And yet still the cars came first, even though there were, I think it was less than 10,000 cars that used King Street every day. This is part of the argument for doing the pilot. But this is the way it works. Even though there are 8 times as many people on streetcars than in cars, the cars still come first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is ultimately the problem, right? It's not rational. I think that this is part of the problem is that a lot of the policy we make these days seems to be ideological. I think that in the 1970s or something, even someone who was a car supporting person would be for the whole transportation system to function, we need to have the public transit move effectively in these areas so that there's less cars on the road and cars that must be there will move faster. It's really become now just we need to shove cars wherever we can shove cars. And the system functioning is secondary to as many cars as possible getting through any given place.
Yeah, and if you do talk about that within the political sphere in Toronto, because I have, and I've been involved in those conversations back when I was doing advocacy, people would say, traffic is terrible in Toronto. We got to do something about it. We got to do something about it. You can't stop cars. You got to do this. Have you been downtown? Have you driven?
Oh my God.
I spent 6 hours. You know what? The thing is, though, like as I say over and over and over again in my videos, there is no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. And you are literally crippling the only alternative so that it is not viable.
Yeah.
Of course you're going to have bad traffic. Toronto is never going to solve its traffic until it can get its head out of its ass and realize you cannot continue to only prioritize cars and reduce traffic. It's impossible.
Well, you've missed our latest congestion crisis in Toronto, which they've called it. It was amazing.
Really?
So I have a few excerpts that have been quite great. So the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto, I think we also may have talked about this, was shut down and is shut down still. I don't know because I don't use it. But this is the highway that goes along the southern end of Toronto. And it's been a huge controversy. There's been all of this talk of, congestion crisis. So it's been very good for identifying who uses the Gardiner on a regular basis, which is, I think it's like 150,000 people or something. So like less people than use like the 3 busiest streetcar routes combined.
Oh, yeah. When I was involved in the Gardiner Expressway teardown discussion, the number of people who use the Gardiner is tiny compared to all other forms of transportation.
And they're not Torontonians.
It was literally like when they looked at the people coming into downtown in the morning rush hour, it was 8%, both directions, 8%. And they were willing to spend over $5 billion on it. It makes no logical sense whatsoever.
Well, and this is a big part of the problem is that you have media in Toronto. And I mean, I think media, for me, I've always thought the media has been a huge part of perpetuating the kind of car-oriented nature of North America because you have these people on all kinds of news who kind of go, we're in a congestion crisis. There's this terrible congestion. We need 24-hour construction for the road. And what's been so funny is that the entire time this has happened, I have never heard a news anchor once mention the fact that right next to the Gardiner Expressway are train lines that you can take that cost less than driving, that run along all the highways in the Toronto area, and that are more frequent than ever that people could be getting on that have not gotten any slower since the Gardiner construction started. This is another form of sabotage, basically, just ignoring that there are already alternatives and just saying, traffic is bad, and kind of inherently saying that we need to build more highways, obviously. That's the only solution. We need more lanes.
Oh, my God. I mean, this is why I couldn't be an advocate anymore, because I started telling people to fuck off. I'm sorry, you're saying, you're a fucking idiot. Like, I'm sorry, but this makes no fucking sense. Like, literally in those words, and then I would get in trouble. But anyway, I don't want to rant too much about Toronto in general here. You know, if you mentioned that in a political news segment, they would inevitably pull out 3 people that can't take the train for whatever reason. And that would be representative of 100% of the people.
Of course, obviously.
But I want to get to something else, though, because when I'm going down Spadina, the other thing that drives me nuts is that when the light does go green, the tram goes so freaking slowly through the intersection. Like, we're talking like 5 kilometers per hour slowly, like less than walking speed slowly.
It's for your safety, obviously.
Especially if there is a switch. So Tell me something about switches.
So Toronto uses a very antiquated form of switch. Now, if you say this in the Toronto context, people say, oh, no, the switch works perfectly well. It's really just, the way we do the single point switch. So we use what's called a single point switch. It is an antiquated technology. Most systems do not use them. The TTC, I believe, custom manufactures their switches. I think they have like a blacksmith that does this.
Of course
no one seems to see this as being, hey, like, that seems weird. Maybe we should not do it that way. Basically, on most switches, both rails kind of move. And so that creates a stability that lets the vehicle go over it quickly. In Toronto, only one of the rails moves. And so basically, there is a bit more of a risk of a derailment. And because the TTC's culture is one that, hey, if they just decided arbitrarily one day that now that they feel there's a risk of derailment, every streetcar must go through switches 5 kilometers per hour. At the same time, the TTC does not have an electronic switch control system that is modern. So in a lot of cities with trams, European cities, you have a sign, like a little light. It just looks like a traffic light that will tell the driver, is the switch pointed one way or the other? So they can go quickly and they know that, hey, like, I'm not going to go full speed through this switch that's going to derail me because it's going to send me off in a different direction.
Yep.
Toronto does not have this system. The switches are very finicky. They don't work half the time. So we often resort to a big metal stick. It's effective. It works well. A driver just needs to leave the vehicle with the big metal stick, go up to the switch with the big metal stick, and then they use the big metal stick to move the switch, and they go back to the vehicle, and it only took 5 minutes, and everything's great, right? So
I think people don't understand this. Like, I think if Europeans could see this happen with their own eyes, they would be like, what is going on here? Like, are we in the 1920s? Because
it feels like it.
Literally, a guy gets out with a big metal stick and goes and like pries the single point switch. And this is why it has to be single point, because if both rails change, you wouldn't be able to use the big metal stick to change it. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And every time I see it, I've never caught it on video. If somebody has good video of this, I want it badly. Never been able to catch it on video because I'm never there at just the right time. It is the dumbest thing you've ever seen in your life. Why are we doing this in 2024, that somebody gets out with a big metal stick?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, in Europe, the systems are controlled electronically. It's a switch.
Yeah, and I don't want to say, you keep saying in Europe, but really it's anywhere except North America, because people in Melbourne right now are screaming at it, going like, what are you talking about? We're fine here too.
They have one serious tram system in Australia, but yes, Melbourne is much better than Toronto. They do the hook turn, which apparently Toronto drivers are not smart enough to do. But that would be a great way of getting rid of those left turns at streetcar intersections by having people go over to the right. And then it would also probably make them understand cyclists better, because cyclists make hook turns all the time.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I think this is the story of the Toronto streetcars. It's dated infrastructure, dated stops, dated switches, dated signaling. Everything is really antiquated except for the vehicles. And there is no curiosity from the agency that runs it, at least not visibly, that goes like, hey, trams seem to work in other places like Melbourne and Hong Kong and Paris and Amsterdam and a million other cities, anywhere. Brussels. Why is it that ours don't? Like, what do we need to change so we can be more standard? It surely would cost less money. Like, money saving, you'd think politicians would be interested. It would surely save money to not custom manufacture switches to be different than what the rest of the world uses. It would surely cost less money to not have to maintain a weird, antiquated signaling system for changing the switches electronically that other cities are not using. All of these things cost money, but we have visionless, spineless leaders who are afraid of, disrupting the status quo, afraid that, well, we must have not done it for a good reason. There must be a good reason that Toronto uses all of these crappy practices. But the reality is, I think, just that we kind of accept it. People just get to work slower in Toronto. And if we want to be able to move around the city faster, we have to demand better, and we have to, implement these policies. And sometimes that'll actually save us money, but we actually have to demand it.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue, as I mentioned at the beginning, is people don't even know what to ask for. They don't even know it's possible, because you can go to Amsterdam, you can go to Paris on vacation and never ride a tram, or you can get on it and be talking and never notice, not realize how far you've gone, how efficiently you've traveled. They just don't even know what to ask for. It's a problem. And compound that with the fact that you have the media, which is just full on obsessed with cars. And all of the things you said, if they improved, could you imagine if they improved the streetcars by following what Paris does or what Amsterdam does or what lots of other cities do, and the streetcars literally ran twice as fast? Could you imagine what that would do to traffic? Like the number of people who would say, like, I know people who live out in Queen East, for example, the beaches and stuff like that, and they work downtown and they drive because the streetcar is slow as hell.
Which is insane.
It takes
an hour. There's a streetcar line right there.
It's a streetcar line right there, literally. Like, they live on the streetcar line, they work on the streetcar line, but they won't take it because it will take them an hour or more when it should take them 25 minutes if things ran the way we're talking about here.
It could be amazing.
Could you imagine? Like, that's the actual solution to this congestion nightmare they've got, right?
Well, I think that the fundamental problem is that I don't think that it even computes for the media of North America that good public transit would have any impact on driving, and that, like, it's actually a market of different options. And when driving is the only option that leaves people feeling dignified, they drive because they don't want to run. Like, imagine if everyone who drove, they had to drive in a 1950s car, and it had like a wooden steering wheel that was like this big, and it had a transistor radio and no
the roads
airbags.
Weren't paved, and there were potholes all over the place.
They wouldn't drive.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't. They wouldn't want to, or they'd yell and complain about it if they knew what to complain about.
But I think that's the thing. I think what we need, and maybe this is a video I would love to watch, is how great can trams be? So I think you've made some videos that definitely touch on it in Amsterdam. I think another great place, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, was Switzerland. Switzerland has amazing trams all over the place. Oh my God.
You go to Basel or you go
Basel's
to
great.
Bern, and it's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. The trams there are better than Amsterdam, and it's a whole other level. And that's when I came back from my trip to Switzerland, and I was like, wow, trams are amazing here. They could be even better. Especially when it comes to accessibility. The number of people in wheelchairs, walkers, and strollers that I saw using the trams in Switzerland were amazing. It was phenomenal.
And they're just nice. Like, they're just nicer trams. Like, I think the quality of the trams and the trains in Switzerland, like, it's a classic thing. But, like, you look at, like, a luxury car, and then you look at a regular car. It's the same thing. Like, there's no reason your tram can't be nice. Your tram can have cool lights, or there's that one tram line in Paris that has the gamer lights on the sides of the trams. It's like...
Oh, and the trams in Japan are like that, too. They're all cool, decorated and everything, I
think that, like anything, if we make it an exciting and attractive form of transportation, while fixing the fundamental problems as well, like, people would get on in droves. And in cities that have the rails already sitting in their streets, I mean, you would be stupid not to use them to their full extent.
That's the thing, right? Because it's expensive to put the rails in the street. This is why when cities do build, they don't build trams in North America very often. They build these LRT systems, which are almost like a subway. Well, not quite, but the similar kind of idea. We don't really have time to get into LRTs. I did want to talk about that. Maybe we can talk about that next time.
I could talk a lot about LRTs.
Yes, we could. And I think we should save it for another episode because LRTs are very often very overbuilt. It's like North America either does the old streetcars that have been around forever, that basically the only reason the streetcars are still in Toronto is because nobody got around to taking them out because they took out a lot of them. When you look at the history...
Yeah, and it would probably cost more money to take out than to just keep it crawling along in its current sad, decrepit state.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing that people should know is that if you live in North America, your town or city had a trolley or a streetcar line. It did. All of them did. Like, I remember looking at where Strongtowns is from. What is it? Brainerd, Minnesota? They had a trolley line.
Smallville.
Yeah, it's like nothing. I think it had like 6,000 people at the time. It had a trolley line. Everything did. They're all gone. And Toronto had way more. Like Mount Pleasant used to have one. They were all over the place and they were torn up.
Yeah, we were not that far away from there. And we literally could see, the route of where the old streetcar would have run. And it's like, it would still be nice if it existed today.
Wouldn't that be great? But the thing is, North America kind of has there's streetcars here because they didn't get around to tearing them out before we figured out that was a bad idea, like Toronto and Philadelphia and San Francisco. Or they have the LRT, which is this massively over-engineered monstrosity we'll talk about in a future video, and kind of nothing in between. No. They don't have that good European.
And I think that is the thing. That is the in-between is exactly where you want to be. That's like where trams thrive, is they're more than a bus. In Toronto, I think that's actually, I never said it, but that's a lot of the problem, is that they treat the streetcars like it's a bus. Like, oh, it's on rubber tires, so it can stop quickly, so we can have more stops. Oh, it can run in mixed traffic because it can go from lane to lane, but it can't because it's a streetcar. That's the problem. But in Europe, you really see, and in Australia and some other places. But okay, most tram systems are in Europe. There's very few outside of Europe.
Yes. Yeah, trams are best in Europe.
They have it in the perfect middle ground where it's not overbuilt. It's very integrated into the streetscape typically, but it's effective and it's not like a bus. There's a clear differentiation and it provides a much higher level of service. And so I think that that's ultimately we need to move towards in all of the world.
Absolutely. And one of the things I noticed when talking about streetcars or transit in general in Toronto and in a lot of North America is that people seem to think it's a hierarchy, like a bus is the bottom, then a streetcar is next, and then a subway, and then a train. And definitely in Toronto, there's this idea that it's like, oh, the streetcars are there and that's nice and all, but if we built a subway under that street instead, then we could get rid of the streetcars and that would be better. And that is something that is crazy to me because, like, these are different things.
Well, yeah, it'd be like saying now that we have the long distance power lines out in the fields of the country, we don't need the power lines in our cities anymore, right?
Right.
Like, these are all part of a network. And I think that's what's really nice when you go to cities that are good at public transit, is you see that they pay attention to every element. I bring up Berlin again because, like, when I was in Berlin, oh, they got a new U-Bahn train here. Oh, there's a new S-Bahn train here. Oh, they just extended the tram here. It feels like every element of the transportation system is getting improved on. In Toronto, doing a lot of good stuff with transit, but it's like only on subways and GO to an extent. Yeah. But the buses and the streetcars, imagine if the same amount of attention, not even money, just attention was given to them. You could get something that's so much better and that would really improve the city. And I mean, I would even say it's happening in some things for like cycling. Like more is happening on cycling in Toronto than streetcars for sure.
Oh, for sure.
It's been negative improvement. Streetcars have gotten worse over the years in Toronto, whereas cycling infrastructure has kind of like steadily been increasing. So I think that's where we're at.
Well, one of the things that annoyed me when I was still doing this advocacy is that you have the streetcar goes from Broadview down King and Queen, and that is, a U-shaped thing. One of the issues at the time was that the Line 1, one of the only north-south subways in all of Toronto, was overcrowded and had too many people. And so they started talking about this idea of the downtown relief line, which would literally take the path of the streetcar. And I'm like, you already have this streetcar that if you just made it better, people would get off early and take the streetcar down instead of going to the crowded subway.
They still could.
But that was never a consideration. Like nobody ever thought even for a second, like it was a major issue. Like platforms would sometimes get so busy, that it was dangerous. Like people could fall onto the tracks. They were so crowded on that Yonge line. And yet there's these streetcars right there that could move so many more people, that could be so much more efficient, that could be so much better. They're right there, and literally nobody talks about it. They're like, no, we got to build a new subway. It's got to be a new subway. And it's always like this. It's always that, like, the streetcars are the way they are. They're going to be like that forever. We're never going to build a new one because streetcars suck. Subways are better. So why would you ever build a streetcar when you could build a subway?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you totally got it right. And I mean, the thing that's so funny is that I think my kind of rough calculation is that if you were to just improve all of the streetcars in Toronto, that alone would add a subway's worth of capacity. As you kind of said, like you have enough lines. Because going from line 2 down into the city center, there's 2 different streetcar lines from the east. And so if you just made them good, you could add enormous capacity and you could really, obviously you still want the subway eventually, but you'd be able to have more options. It would not be, it's having great streetcars and a great subway. These are not mutually exclusive. Like this just makes the city better, but you could get the streetcars much more quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I go to Rotterdam. They've done a huge improvement on this main street. Rotterdam's very car-centric by European standards, certainly by Dutch standards, because it was rebuilt after World War II. It was bombed, right? But there's this major street called the Koolsingel, and it has a subway running right under it, a metro running right under it. And right above the metro is a tram line. They run literally one right on top of the other because they have different purposes.
Yeah, and that's actually good because what it means is it's like everyone goes to New York and says, well, it's so amazing. You have local and express. And it's like, wow, you could do the same thing. You could have the tram be local and the subway underneath the express. And anyways, go watch the Rotterdam's Metro Explained video on RM Transit to learn more about that system.
Great video. I think we should probably cap it there. I would like to have you back to talk about LRTs because I really wanted to get to that. But there's just so much to talk about in this. There's even some things we didn't get to, like the fact that Toronto still uses those, like sometimes I think they're finally not using it. They still use those trolley poles.
They still use it, I think, a few places, but
they're
mostly rid of them.
And they have the pantograph, but because they still have to support the trolley poles, the pantograph can't work properly where the line goes back and forth. And so it rubs the pantograph unevenly and that has to be replaced more. The carbon shoes need to be replaced more. It's just It's
wild. How did these European cities fix this? It's like they did this all in like the 1920s. I don't know how they did it without computers and Microsoft Word and stuff.
It's like how long have pantographs been around? I think it was the crocodile.
At least 100 years, like more than that.
Yeah, it's been over 100 years, I believe. I believe it was 1818 was the first, and don't quote me on that. But it's over 100 years ago that pantographs were invented, and we were still using trolley poles up until a couple of years ago. I think we still are, like you said, on a couple of places. And this is the thing that just drives me so nuts about Toronto's transit is that when I start researching, when I start digging in, no matter what corner I come at it, whatever side I come at it from, no matter where I look, it makes no fucking sense. It's dumb. They do something dumb. All the time, everywhere, all throughout the system, it's like infected.
No, I mean, I could really so one thing I love, and this is my parting thought, is some people like it. I don't like the TTC logo. I think it looks dated. I mean, like, I understand. I like heritage and all of that. And I think, like, lots of places have old logos that they've kept around in a nice mural somewhere, or they put it in a museum. But like, you're literally sending people the message that we are from the 1950s with your 1950s logo.
Yes.
Look at the logos of other public transit systems that are like modern design icons. And then you've got Toronto with its freaking literal out of the 30s logo. When people see it, again, unlike a lot of people in Toronto, I'm like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I have like family that comes and visits and friends. And they're always like, what the hell is that? What's that sign? What does that mean? They can't even read it. It's illegible. Right? It's all across the board. We really need, Toronto needs some fresh ideas.
Yes. And people need to learn what to ask for so that they can demand it, so they can go to these community outreach.
And I think all that takes is going to one of these cities. Like there are many, we could name 100 good tram cities. Budapest, another good one. Prague.
Sure.
And just ride and look at the signs, look at the switches, pay attention to how the signal priority works. Watch, are there platforms? Are there not platforms? What do the vehicles look like? I think that people just need to pay attention to those details, take pictures and blog about it, write about it, send pictures to your city councilor. I mean, like, there are so many different little details that can be improved, but I think people really need to familiarize themselves with them.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly important in Toronto because, again, the media is not on your side. They're all about, we got these critical car issues. Why are you talking about these stupid streetcars that are just in the way of the cars? But also, like I mentioned a few times, there are suburban councillors in Toronto who actively sabotage these projects. Like, they go out of their way to get rid of them. And there are politicians in the past and in the present who want to remove the streetcars in Toronto. So there are people who are actively moving to get rid of them. And I guarantee you, I'd put money on this, that when the Ontario line is completed, there are going to be cars to remove the Queen streetcar or to change it or to get rid of it in parts, because now we got a subway. Why do we need the stupid streetcar here? It's going to happen. And so this is why it's so important for people in Toronto to understand that trams can be so good and so much better, because on the other side, there are people who want to get rid of them.
Definitely.
Anyway, thanks so much for having you on. I think it's just, oh, God, man. I just love trams so much.
No, I mean, honestly, I was thinking about it, and there could be an entire YouTube channel just about like trams, just about like how they're implemented, like different tram cities, like profiles of different cities. Like just nice videos of the trams in different cities. I'd watch the hell out of that.
You could call it Not Just Bikes.
Not just subways.
I have not made nearly enough videos about trams, and that is entirely my fault. And the reason for that is that every time I go to do it, I've had this video in my head, I have notes down, I have half a script, maybe a quarter of a script about trams. I want to talk about trams, but it's such a big subject. I almost don't know how to like cut it off.
But that's why I say, like, I think it almost needs to be something bigger, because there are so many things that you could potentially talk about. And I think that, as I said before, they're really situational. There's a lot of design that goes into trams, and that's what makes them interesting. That's why there's like a million things to say about them.
Yes, but it's also why they're easy to sabotage by just getting rid of some of those key elements. Anyway, Reese, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely do want to have you back to talk about LRTs, but this is great. Yeah, we get to rant about trams again.
Always good.
Always good.
But always terrible to be on the trams in Toronto for now. But hopefully that changes. It can change.
It can change, and I would love to see it, because as I get older, it is not safe for my blood pressure to be that high.
I mean, I really think someday it's possible. If I ever get the opportunity to be CEO of the TTC, like, I can imagine amazing things. Like, that's what's, I think, frustrating about it for me, is that there's not that many things that in a single political term you could actually overhaul, but I think you could overhaul the streetcars completely in 4 years.
You probably could.
Yeah.
Gotta happen. Okay, thanks so much for coming on. Great to talk to you as always. And if you don't know RM Transit for some reason, if you've made it to the end of this podcast, make sure you check him out on YouTube, RM Transit. He makes videos about transit all over the world.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
That's all we have on the agenda for today. I hope you enjoyed listening to it almost as much as we enjoyed making it. I really enjoy talking to other content creators about what they find interesting, and a lot of the people I have on this podcast I met since joining Nebula. Nebula is the subscription streaming service created by and for educational content creators and the people who love their content. Nebula has all sorts of educational content, from videos to podcasts to classes by your favorite creators, as well as Nebula Originals, which are high-budget productions. Honestly, Nebula is such a great platform, and I'm so happy for my content to be available there. If you use our special link, which is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount off an annual membership, which comes to only $30 a year, which I think is a fantastic deal. So check out Nebula at nebula.tv/agenda and see if there's something of interest to you. At the very least, you'll be able to hear every episode of the Urbanist Agenda a little bit earlier than everyone else, so you can get the inside scoop on what we're plotting and scheming. Thanks again for listening, and maybe next time you'll be listening on Nebula.